Chapter 57 Mazen. They returned to the desert with horses and equipment the next day. Mazen felt like he'd woken from a dream. For some reason, unbeknownst to him, the merchant refused to speak about last night. He thought she was beginning to enjoy his company the same way he relished hers, but now he wondered if he'd inadvertently done something to reopen the rift between them. At least she'd made up with her bodyguard. His presence softened her anger into a calmer irritation. Mazen was envious of their relationship. What must it be like, he wondered, to be so close to someone you could demand all their secrets? He had Hakim, but Hakim was his brother, and the only honest member of the family, he thought grimly. His father's past was a mystery, and who knew how many secrets Omar was keeping? Mazen pushed the unease away, resolved to focus on the journey. Though they had lost their map, he cringed every time he thought about his brother's beautiful work buried in the sand sea. They were not directionless. They had the merchant's magic compass, after all. The arrow guided them down crooked pathways between cliffs and through quiet valleys cut through with the occasional brook or stream. Though the weather was more hospitable here than in the open desert, the terrain was not. The pathways were bumpier, and it was not long before Mazen discovered new aches in his back and thighs. But those pains were small grievance, trifling in comparison to the tenacious ghouls and the deadly killer they'd faced. In the daylight hours, Mazen trailed Aisha on hunts, helped Kadir build traps, and joined Luli on trips to refill water skins. He was not especially good at the first two tasks. He scared off prey and possessed the uncanny ability to sabotage incomplete traps. At least he could fail without worry of giving away his identity. And the water gathering was a respite, a time for him to take in his surroundings without worrying about the road ahead. It was unfortunate that his good mood was fleeting, dissipating when a few days later they arrived at their first outpost after leaving the cliffs. When he went to gather supplies, he overheard gossip that sent his mind spinning. He heard talk of chaos in Medine, of more frequent jinn attacks, more death in the souk. The news unnerved him. Hadn't Omar stayed in the city to improve its security? So why were there more jinn coming to Medine? But the most perplexing rumors were the ones about himself. There were reports he'd been sneaking out of the palace in his royal garments alone. He was nonplussed, unable to understand why Omar would betray his trust so explicitly. I never should have left. Mazen trapped the regretful words between his teeth. Soon this would all be over. He would bring the lamp back and... what? Some Ifrit would save them all? And his father would lock him away in his room forever for disobeying his orders? It seemed a terrifyingly plausible nightmare. Later, when they set off into the desert once more, Mazen shared the news with the others. Aisha shrugged off his accusations, insisting she was not privy to Omar's thoughts. Mazen knew that was not the truth. He had overheard Tawil speaking in their hideout, after all. He just didn't know how to decipher their conversation. When he had no success gleaning answers from her, he turned the conversation to the lamp they were seeking. He asked Kadir about the being trapped inside. "You told me you didn't know anything about the lamp," Luli said to Kadir, voice laced with accusation. Kadir, who sat atop his horse with the usual nonchalant expression upon his face, only raised a brow in response. "Because I do not. I wasn't in the human world when one of my companions was trapped in the lamp, but..." Aisha shrugged. "It has to be Rija." Kadir sighed. "Yes." Mazen stared between the two of them. "Rija?" "The shapeshifter," Aisha said. "Your stories speak of a jinn king with a bloated ego. If there is even an inkling of truth to them, then they are referring to Rija." Mazen thought of the story that had been passed down through his family. He'd originally believed that human stories about jinn were fables, but maybe they were just one version of the truth, complicated over time. "Gods, they're going to be livid," Aisha said. "Stuck in the sand sea for hundreds of years. What a nightmare." Mazen blinked. "They?" Kadir shrugged. "Rija is whatever Rija wants to be. Man, woman, child, beast. They are all of those things and more." It was a novel concept of identity, and Mazen was thoughtful as they lapsed into peaceful silence. The quiet remained as they traveled through gorges and into flat desert plains, where the sun finally made its reappearance. Mazen would have lain down in the sand and basked in its warmth if the others hadn't been so set on making good time to their destination. He wished he shared their eagerness, but no. All he had to look forward to was some unknowable punishment. He sat back in his saddle and tried to ingrain the details of this moment into his mind. The clear and endless sky, the shadows of distant tents on the hazy horizon, the hiss and sigh of the ground beneath his horse's hoofs. He even relished the weight of the sand on his clothing and in his boots, knowing it was a testament to his travels. This is not a story, he told himself. This is reality, and I am living it right now. Even if his future was dismal, he was determined to make this final reprieve last as long as he could. And so he focused on his surroundings and the awe they inspired in him. He watched as the landscape became awash in red gold shades of sunset, and when the sky darkened, he marveled at the shadows which spread across the desert like ink stains. There were stars glimmering in the sky by the time they came to an oasis. The merchant and her bodyguard sped ahead, bantering as they raced toward their destination. Mazen held back a sigh as he watched them go. He wished he had that easygoing repartee with Luli. Your jealousy is showing, Saidi. Aisha pulled up beside him. She took a swig from her water skin before handing it to him. He drank to avoid answering. Afterward, he swiped a hand across his mouth and said, What do you make of the news from Medine? Weren't you all supposed to stop Jin from breaking into the city? That was the plan. Obviously, something's gone amiss. There was another short silence before Mazen said, I know you and Tawil were discussing something you didn't want me to overhear. You were talking about a plan. A plan to lead you through the desert in one piece. That's not what it sounded like. It sounded like Omar was searching for Ifrit relics. Aisha sighed. And collecting relics for him is one of my responsibilities. Not Ifrit relics, Mazen frowned. You're hiding something from me. There has to be a reason my brother is so wary of Ahmed bin Walid. A reason he's sneaking out as me. Aisha mirrored his frown. It doesn't matter what you think. I'm not obligated to tell you anything. She looked down her nose at him, unimpressed, before riding ahead. Later, after they set up camp, Mazen sat at the edge of the oasis beneath the shadow of a date tree and stared at the stars reflected on the water. He thought about how the first time he'd come to such a place, he'd been his brother. Now he'd regressed into Mazen, sometimes Yusuf, a prince so spineless he couldn't even demand secrets from his own subjects. Can't sleep, prince? He was startled out of his reverie by the merchant, who suddenly stood beside him, gaze trained on the star-speckled water. She didn't look at him as she said, Does this remind you of home? Of the lakes in your palace courtyard made of jinn blood? That's not fair, he said quietly. I haven't killed any jinn. Why do you assume I share my brother's morals? Why shouldn't I assume? You're both liars who share the same father. The accusation made his heart sink. He had been hopeful Luli was beginning to see him as himself, without any masks. But though it was dispiriting, he supposed it was natural that her animosity towards his family colored her opinion of him. But Luli surprised him by continuing. At least that's what I would have said before I heard you in the souk. Her eyes finally settled on him. My parents used to say a story could reveal the heart of the teller. I see that truth in you. When you shared your mother's history, I heard her optimism reflected in your words. You are not like Omar. Mazen swallowed. Why did it suddenly feel like his heart was in his throat? I hope not. His gaze sank to the water. In any case, I have more in common with Hakim than Omar, and we don't share any blood at all. Have the two of you always been close? Always, ever since he came to the palace. Mazen deflated with his sigh. It had been a long time since he remembered the moments he spent with his whole family. He remembered the meals they'd shared in the courtyard, the nightly stories his mother had told. He remembered the way his father had smiled with unbridled joy in his eyes. The way Hakim had wandered the gardens, bright-eyed and free, pointing at different flowers and describing them to Mazen. When my mother was alive, the palace was a sanctuary for us, not a prison. His voice cracked. He had to pause to take a deep breath. My father was a different person then, too. He was kinder, more patient. My mother taught him to trust again after, well, you know. The wife killings, the merchant murmured. He really never explained why he did it. Mazen shook his head, mute. The rumors always said it was Hakim's mother who had inspired his distrust, but that had never seemed like the full truth. The Sultan himself never spoke of those murders. Mazen suspected he never would. Well, Shafia was a marvel for being able to change him, Lily said. She was. He pulled his knees to his chest, rested his chin on them. Back then, my father was too. He didn't care about jinn and relics. He talked about redemption. Once I wanted to be like him. He could see the merchant watching him out the corner of his eye. She surprised him by saying, "Well, if there's anyone who can show him the meaning of redemption, it's you." Mazen looked up at her. "Me?" The merchant shrugged. "The way I see it, you could have left me behind in the ruins, but you came back. And when I asked you about Imad, you answered me honestly." Her lips quirked. "I can tell. You're easy to read." "You saved me before, too. Twice," he sighed. "My father was the one to send you on this quest. The least I can do is try to see you safely through it." The merchant turned away with a snort. "Your honesty is a foible, Prince." She paused. "But also a treasure. Don't underestimate your ability to influence others." She left him alone to puzzle over her words.